Welcome to the RPTM podcast, the show that breaks down the myths of monolithic history and tells our story through multiple lenses. I'm your host, Professor Ryan Lancaster. Today's episode is partially underwritten by you, the listener. Find out ways to support the podcast on my website, ryanglancaster.com. Episode 23, Eli Whitney, Cookbooks, Bank Heists, and American Fitness. Next rule of history: beware pseudo-history. Much like pseudoscience, a pseudo-history is a form of pseudo-scholarship that attempts to distort or misrepresent the historical record, often using methods resembling legitimate historical research. Some of its characteristics are as follows. Pseudo-history is unfalsifiable or can't be proven wrong. It makes vague or unobservable claims. A classic example is Christopher Columbus discovered America. Pseudo-history relies heavily on anecdotes, personal experiences, and testimonials. One great example is Clara Davis, circa 1937, waxing nostalgic about her days of bondage in Alabama. While she may miss her time as a slave, her experience is not representative of others. Pseudo-history cherry-picks confirming evidence while ignoring or minimizing disconcerting evidence. Yahoo recently faced some backlash for publishing an article titled "Chris Pratt Criticized for White Supremacist T-Shirt" after the actor was spotted wearing a shirt portraying a version of the Gadsden flag. Yahoo pinpointed some comments on social media that linked the symbol to far-right groups and white supremacy ideologies and noted that the Gadsden flag, created by American Revolutionary War General Christopher Gadsden, portrays a racially charged message. However, while some social media posts did criticize Chris Pratt for wearing his shirt, many recognized the flags originated in a non-racial context and therefore did not accuse Pratt of being racist. Yahoo later changed the article's name after being called out for cherry-picking some online commenters and turning their opinions into a clickbait headline. Pseudo-history uses obfuscation, words that sound scientific but don't make sense. It consists of buzzwords, esoteric language, specialized technical terms, or technical slang that is impossible to understand for the average listener. For example, some historians will throw out some big words and fancy sentences to confuse people about what they mean. Pseudo-history lacks plausible mechanism. No way to explain it based on existing knowledge. For example, a public prosecutor says in an interview that there is anarchy in the land. While expressing a disappointment, this remark is made by him that he cannot prosecute someone in the imported system which has murdered another. This is because the matter has now been settled traditionally in the village by two opposing clans. Anarchy is a relative term and hard to measure. Pseudo-history is unchanging, doesn't self-correct or progress. If we don't ever reevaluate, the dinosaurs would still drag their tails, or the Japanese internment camps of the 1940s would still be measured as a success. Pseudo-history makes extraordinary or exaggerated claims with insufficient evidence. A great example of this is the claim of Irish slavery. The claim that colonists enslaved Irish people in the British American Colonies stems from misrepresentation of the idea of indentured servitude. Indentured servants were people required to complete unpaid labor for their contracted period. Pseudo-history professes certainty, talks of proof, with great confidence, the determination of whether a witness testified in a specific fact based on a particular knowledge. A couple of examples. Caesar knew that the warriors of Gaul, as he had the first-hand knowledge, but does this mean he knew the various aspects of the whole tribe? Another would be, Aidan believes God spoke to him. Did God speak to him? Pseudo-history commits logical fallacies. Arguments contain errors in reasoning. A well-known argument that Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor should have been predictable in the United States because of the many indications that an attack was imminent. This argument overlooks that there were innumerable conflicting signs that suggested possibilities other than an attack on Pearl Harbor. Only in retrospect do the warning signs seem obvious. Signs which pointed in different directions tend to be forgotten. Pseudo-history lacks peer review and goes directly to the public, avoiding scientific scrutiny. Not to say that these sources don't include the truth. You should use them, but be wary. There are some kinds of publications that should be avoided while searching for peer-reviewed material. They are newspapers, magazines, ads or other sponsored material, editorials or opinion pieces, and book reviews. Pseudo-history claims that there is a conspiracy to suppress their ideas. These include ancient aliens, ethnocentric revisionism, and historical revisionism. More on these later. This should help you avoid pitfalls in the meantime. Eli Whitney. In 1794, U.S.-born inventor Eli Whitney patented the cotton gin, a machine that revolutionized cotton production by considerably speeding up removing seeds from cotton fiber. By the mid-19th century, cotton had become America's leading export. Despite its successes, the gin made little money for Whitney due to a patent infringement issue. Also, his invention offered Southern planters a justification to maintain and expand slavery, even as a growing number of Americans supported its abolition. Based in part on his reputation for creating the cotton gin, Whitney later secured a significant contract to build muskets for the U.S. government. Through this project, he promoted the idea of interchangeable parts, standardized, identical parts that made for faster assembly and easier repair for various devices. For his work, he is credited as a pioneer of American manufacturing. Whitney quickly learned that Southern planters were in a desperate need of making the growing of cotton profitable. Long staple cotton, which was easy to separate from its seeds, could be grown along the coast. The one variety that grew inland had sticky green seeds that were time-consuming to pick out of the white fluffy cotton balls. Whitney was encouraged to find a solution to this problem by his employer, Catherine Green, whose support, both moral and financial, were critical to this effort. At stake was the success of cotton planting throughout the South, significant when tobacco was declining in profit due to oversupply and soil exhaustion. Whitney knew that he could apply to the federal government for a patent if he could invent such a machine. If granted, he would have exclusive rights to this invention for 14 years. Today it's 20 years. And he could hope to reap a handsome profit from it. In hopes of making a patentable machine, Whitney put aside his plans to study law and instead tinkered throughout the winter and spring in a secret workshop provided by Catherine Green. Within months, he had created a cotton gin. A small gin could be hand-cranked. Larger versions could be harnessed to a horse and driven by water power. One man and a horse will do more than 50 men with the old machines, wrote Whitney to his father. 'Tis generally said by those who know anything about it that I shall make a fortune by it. By patenting an invention and making a profit from it are two different things. After considering possible options, Whitney and his business partner, Phineas Miller, opted to produce as many gins as possible, install them throughout Georgia and the South, and charge farmers a fee for doing the ginning for them. Their charge was 2/5 of the profit, paid to them in cotton itself. And here all their troubles began. Farmers throughout Georgia resented having to go to Whitney's gins, where they had to pay what they regarded as an excessive tax. Instead, planters began making their versions of Whitney's gin and claiming they were new inventions. Miller brought costly suits against the owners of these pirated versions, but because of the loophole in the wording of the 1793 Patent Act, they were unable to win any lawsuits until 1800, when the law was changed. Struggling to make a profit and mired in legal battles, the partners finally agreed to license gins at the reasonable price. In 1802, South Carolina decided to purchase Whitney's patent right for $50,000, but delayed paying it. The partners also arranged to sell the patent's rights to North Carolina and Tennessee. By the time even the Georgia courts recognized the wrongs done to Whitney, only 1 year of his patent remained. In 1808 and again in 1812, he humbly petitioned Congress for the renewal of his patent. After the invention of the cotton gin, the yield of raw cotton doubled each decade after 1800. Demand was fueled by other designs of the Industrial Revolution, such as the machines to spin and weave it and the steamboat to transport it. By mid-century, America was growing 3/4 of the world's cotton supply, most of it shipped to England and New England, where it was manufactured into cloth. During this time, tobacco fell in value, rice exports at best stayed steady, and sugar began to thrive, but only in Louisiana. At mid-century, the South provided 3/5 of the world's export, most of it in cotton. However, like many inventors, Whitney, who died in 1825, could not have foreseen how his invention would change society for the worse. The most significant of these was the growth of slavery. While the cotton gin reduced the labor and removing of seeds, it did not reduce the need for slaves to grow and pick the cotton. The opposite occurred. Cotton growing became so profitable for the planters that it significantly increased their demand for both land and slave labor. In 1790, there were 6 slave states. In 1860, there were 15. By 1790, until Congress banned the importation of slaves from Africa in 1808, Southerners imported 80,000 Africans. By 1860, approximately 1 in 3 Southerners was a slave. Because of the cotton gin, slaves now labored on even larger plantations where work was more disciplined and relentless. As large plantations spread into the Southwest, the price of slaves and inhibited the growth of cities and industries. In 1850s, 7/8 of the immigrants settled in the North, where they found 72% of the nation's manufacturing capacity. The growth of the peculiar institution was affecting many aspects of Southern life. While Eli Whitney is best remembered as the inventor of the cotton gin, he is often forgotten that he also is the father of mass production methods. In 1798, he figured out how to manufacture muskets by machines so that the parts were interchangeable. It was the manufacture of muskets that Whitney became finally rich. If his genius led King Cotton to triumph in the South, it also created the technology with which the North won the Civil War. American Cookery. American Cookery, published by the orphan Amelia Simmons in 1796, was the first cookbook by an American to be published in the United States. Its 47 pages contain good recipes for roasts, stuffed goose, stuffed legs of veal, and roast lamb. There were stews, too, and all manners of pie, but the cakes expressed best what this first cookbook had to say about its country. It was a place that acknowledged its British heritage, to be sure, but was ultimately a new kind of place, with a new type of cuisine and a new type of citizen cook. American Cookery sold well for the next 30 years, mainly in New England, New York, and the Midwest, before falling into oblivion. Since the 1950s, it has attracted an enthusiastic audience, from historians to home cooks. The Library of Congress recently designated the American Cookery as one of the 88 books that shaped America. The collection of recipes, which appeared in numerous legitimate and plagiarized editions, is a cultural phenomenon as a cooking book. In the early years of the Republic, Americans were engaged in a lively debate over their identity. With freedom from Britain and the establishment of a Republican government came a need to assert a distinctly American way of life. The book accomplished this feat in 2 significant ways. First, it was part of a broader initiative led by social and political elites in Connecticut that advanced a particular brand of Yankee culture and commerce as a model for American life and good taste. At the same time, its authors spoke directly to ordinary American women coping with everyday challenges and frustrations. American Cookery was a Connecticut project. There, still mainly agricultural society of small independent farms was positioned to benefit from trading networks, near and far. But moving beyond mere subsistence farming required an openness to these new markets and the world of commerce in general. Connecticut's Federalist leaders were well connected in influential newspapers, printers, and booksellers. They were able to proclamate a vision of an America where agriculture would flourish with the help of commerce, rather than in opposition to it. Jeffersonians who disagreed with this outlook emphasized rural life as an end in itself. For them, the future of American society depended on the spread of smallholder farmers, whose rustic simplicity would inoculate their fledgling country against the corrupting influence of the luxury to which Britain had succumbed. The two camps took part in a public debate about indulgences. Were they totems of prosperity or symbols of social decay? Some American thinkers maintained that the full simplicity should form the basis of American cooking and eating. But the Connecticut Federalists thought such self-denial left too little room for the ambitions of everyday people to improve their lot. These moderates preferred to encourage a kind of restrained gentility that would, in time, become the parlor decency of Victorian America. For those in the Federalist camp, promoting education and the modest enjoyment of worldly goods would help build an enlightened society. With its new take on a practical topic, American cookery caught the spirit of the times. The first cookbook includes foods with cranberry sauce, Johnny cakes, Indian slapjacks, the custard-style pumpkin pie. Moreover, Symonds had kept an understanding of the care that went into the construction of American household abundance. Behind every fabulous array table lay the precise management of all the fruits and vegetables, meats and poultry, preserves and jellies, and cakes and pies that sustained the home and family. And American cookery gave cooks and homemakers tips for everyday cooking, as well as occasions that when the aim was to express greater gentility. This reproduction of the first American written cookbook published in the United States is a first in the cookbook literature and a historical document. It reveals the rich variety of food colonial Americans enjoyed, their tastes, cooking and eating habits, even their colorful language. Symonds explained how to keep peas green until Christmas and how to dry peaches. Above all, American cookery proposed a cuisine combining British foods, long favored in the colonies and viewed as part of a redefined lifestyle, with dishes made with local ingredients and associated with homegrown foodways. It asserted cultural independence from the mother country, even as it offered a comfortable level of continuity with British cooking traditions. American cookery also carried emotional appeal, striking a chord with American women living in sometimes trying circumstances. Outside of this one book, there's little evidence that Amelia Symonds her existence. The title page refers to her as an American orphan. Publishers Hudson and Goodwin may have sought her out, or vice versa. The cookbook's first edition notes that it had published for the author, which at the time usually meant that the writer funded the endeavor. Whatever Symonds' backstory might have been, American Cookery offers tantalizing hints of the struggles she faced. Although brief, the prefaces of the first two editions are written in distinctive voice. In her first preface, Symonds recounts the trials of female orphans, quote, who, by the loss of their parents or other unfortunate circumstances, are reduced to the necessity of going into families in the line of domestics or taking refuge with their friends or relations, end quote. She warns that any such young female orphan, quote, though left to the care of virtuous guardians, will find it essentially necessary to have an opinion and determination of her own, end quote. For a female in such circumstances, the only course is in adherence to those rules and maxims which have stood the test of ages and will forever establish the female character a virtuous character. Lest the point somehow be missed, Symonds again reminds readers that unlike women who have parents or brothers or riches to defend their indiscretions, a poor solitary orphan must rely solely upon character. The Alien and Sedition Acts. The Alien and Sedition Acts were a series of 4 laws passed by the U.S. Congress in 1798 amid widespread fear that war with France was imminent. The four laws, which remain controversial to this day, restricted foreign residents' activities and limited freedom of speech and the press. The Federalist Party, which supported a strong central government, had dominated mainly politics in the new nation before 1796, when John Adams won election as the second U.S. president. In opposition to the Federalists stood the Democratic-Republican Party, commonly known as Republicans or Jeffersonians for their ideological leader, Thomas Jefferson. Republicans wanted to reserve more power over state governments and accused the Federalists of leaning more towards a monarchic style of government. The two parties also diverged dramatically over issues of foreign policy. In 1794, the Federalist administration of George Washington signed the Jay Treaty with Britain, significantly improving Anglo-American relations but angering the French, who were at war with Britain. Soon after Adams took office, he sent a three-member delegation to Paris to meet with a foreign minister, Charles Talleyrand. Instead, three French representatives, referred to in an official U.S. document as X, Y, and Z, demanded a $250,000 bribe as well as a loan of $10 million before talks could begin. After the Americans refused, word of the so-called XYZ affair spread at home, sparking outrage and calls of war against France. Amid mounting tensions, Federalists accused Republicans of being in league with France against their own country's government. In June 1798, in the Gazette of the United States, Alexander Hamilton called the Jeffersonians more Frenchmen than Americans. He claimed that they were prepared to immolate the independence and welfare of their country at the shrine of France. Fears of an imminent French invasion led the Adams administration to begin war preparations and pass a new land tax to pay for them. With concerns about spy enemies infiltrating American society, Federalist majority in the Congress passed four new laws in June and July 1798, collectively known as the Alien and Sedition Acts. With the Naturalization Act, Congress increased residency requirements for U.S. citizenship to 14 years from 5. Many recent immigrants and new citizens favor the Republicans. The Alien Enemies Act permitted the government to arrest and deport all male citizens of an enemy nation in the event of a war. At the same time, the Alien Friends Act allowed the president to deport any non-citizen suspected of plotting against the government, even in peacetime. More importantly, Congress passed the Sedition Act, which took direct aim at those who spoke out against Adams or the Federalist-dominated government. Even as the bitter debates between the two fledgling political parties were being played out in rival newspapers and other publications, the new law outlawed any false, scandalous, and malicious writing against Congress or the president. It made it illegal to conspire to oppose any measure or measures of the government. The Republican minority in Congress complained that the Sedition Act violated the First Amendment to the Constitution, which protected freedom of speech and press freedom. But the Federalist majority pushed it through, arguing that English and American courts had long punished seditious libel under common law and that the freedom of speech must be balanced with the individual's responsibility for false statements. Adams signed the Sedition Act into law on July 14, 1798. It was set to expire March 3, 1801, the last day of his term in office. The legislators of their respective states passed the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions in response to the Alien Sedition Acts. James Madison authored the Virginia resolutions in collaboration with Thomas Jefferson, who also authored the Kentucky resolution. Both argued that the federal government did not have the authority to enact laws not specific in the Constitution. Jefferson wrote, "The several states who form the instrument, or the Constitution, being sovereign and independent, have the unquestionable right to judge of its infractions, and that its nullification by those states of all unauthorized acts is the rightful remedy." Matthew Lyon, a Republican congressman from Vermont, became the first person tried under the new law in October 1798. A grand jury indicted Lyon for publishing letters in Republican newspapers during his re-election campaign that showed intent and design to defame the government and President Adams, along other charges. Lyon acted as his attorney and defended himself by claiming the Sedition Act was unconstitutional and that he had not intended to damage the government. He was convicted, and the judge sentenced him to 4 months in prison and a fine of $1,000. Lyon won re-election while sitting in jail and later defeated a Federalist attempt to kick him out of the House. Another individual famously prosecuted under the Sedition Act was the Republican-friendly journalist James Callender. Sentenced to 9 months in prison for his false, scandalous, and malicious writing against the said President of the United States, Callender wrote articles from jail supporting Jefferson's campaign for president in 1800. After Jefferson won, Callender demanded a government post in return for his service. When he failed to get one, he retaliated by revealing the first public allegations of Jefferson's long-rumored relationship with a slave woman, Sally Hemings, in a new series of newspaper articles. All told, between 1798 and 1801, U.S. federal courts prosecuted at least 26 individuals under the Sedition Act. Many were editors of Republican newspapers, and all opposed the Adams administration. Prosecutions fueled furious debate over the meaning of free press and the rights that should be afforded to political opposition parties in the United States. In the end, widespread anger over the Alien and Sedition Acts fueled Jefferson's victory over Adams' bitterly contested 1800 presidential election. Their passage is widely considered one of the biggest mistakes of Adams' presidency. By 1802, all of the Alien and Sedition Acts had been repealed or expired, save the Alien Enemies Act, which has stayed on the books. In 1918, Congress amended the act to include women. The first bank heist. In 1793, Scotsman Patrick Lyon arrived off the boat in Philadelphia, looking to seek his fortune and play his part in the American dream. Philadelphia was home of the United States government back then, so it made sense he'd be realizing his ambitions there. Lyon was a master smith whose skills would come to be in high demand. It didn't start that way, though. His first American employer cheated him on wages. Eventually, his skill as a locksmith, blacksmith, and a clever mechanic earned him a good reputation and a decent living. His work impressed many, especially his creation of an excellent fire engine. He probably saw the initial disappointment as a bump in the road to success. However, it wasn't the only obstacle Lyon encountered before he finally established himself in life. Following that brush with a devious employer, he was then caught up in a situation that threatened not only his standing, but his very liberty. 5 years after his arrival, Lyon was arrested and imprisoned as the prime suspect in America's first ever bank heist. The target was the Bank of Pennsylvania, which was temporarily operating out of Carpenter's Hall. Ironically, this financial institution had escaped a previous attempt to steal its contents before setting up shop to await construction of new premises. As Saturday night became Sunday morning on August 1st, 1798, $162,821 was lifted from the bank's vault. The news was shocking, and Lyon was in the frame because he had recently worked on the vault doors at his workshop. High Constable John Haynes saw him as the natural culprit, with the $2,000 reward playing no part whatsoever in his reasoning. He made Lyon his chief suspect as he was one of those ingenious Celts from the old country who could open up the cleverest locks devised within a minute. Haynes didn't have to hunt Lyons down like a dog. The master smith had arrived back in Philadelphia dog-tired, having made a 150-mile journey on foot upon hearing of the robbery. He had strong suspicions about who might have committed the crime. Lyon had more on his mind than criminality, of course. He'd made the trek from Lewiston, or Louis, Delaware, having fled Philadelphia with his young apprentice. This was to escape a natural calamity that engulfed the city, to which the daring heist was merely a worrying footnote. Yellow fever had been carried across America by mosquitoes since the late 17th century. But in 1793, as Lyon made his new home in Philadelphia, so did Caribbean refugees carrying the notorious disease. Yellow fever, or the American plague as it was known at the time, is a viral disease that begins with a fever and muscle pain. Next, victims often become jaundiced, hence the term yellow fever, as their liver and kidneys cease functioning normally. Some of the afflicted then suffered even worse symptoms. Famous early American Cotton Mather described it as turning yellow, then vomiting and bleeding every way. The outbreak claimed as many as 100 lives a day, including Lyon's wife and child. The evacuation was in everyone's mind, from officials to citizens. The bereaved artisan had hoped to beat a hasty retreat, but he had called upon to undertake an important task at the last minute, a job involving a door vaults at the Bank of Philadelphia. His new customers were Samuel Robinson and Isaac Davis. Robinson was part of the Carpenter's Hall hierarchy and facilitated the bank's stay therein. As for Davis, he was a stranger to Lyon. There was an air of mystery about proceedings, with the urgent nature of their assignment being a little too critical for Lyon's taste. He believed the locks and fitting were substandard and not fit for purpose. Lyon watched Davis try the new keys repeatedly. After Lyon had finished working, he met both men at the restaurant and an uneasy feeling that they were uncomfortable seeing him. Things fell into place for Lyon when he heard about the big steal miles from the scourge of yellow fever. His apprentice hadn't been so lucky and died a couple days after they departed. The Scottish smith felt he had no option but to return to the Lion's Mouth and report his suspicions. He was promptly locked up in a cramped, unsanitary environment, which put him squarely in the fever's path. Some accounts state, having expected so much effort avoiding the disease in the first place, Lyon finally contracted it, though thankfully survived the experience. Luck was also on his side in a way he couldn't have foreseen. For reasons best known to himself, one of the robbers was utterly incompetent. Isaac Davis, the stranger who had accompanied Samuel Robinson with the vault doors, had taken such an interest in them, was one of two men who carried out the deed. The other was Thomas Cunningham, a bank porter. His role in the story is crucial but relatively short, as he died from yellow fever days later. Davis had begun depositing large amounts of stolen money from the Bank of Philadelphia back into the Bank of Philadelphia. It didn't take long for authorities to smell a rat, and Davis soon confessed. Lyon had been in prison for 2 months by that stage. Unfortunately, it wasn't the end of his misery. He was eventually released in 1799, having languished unnecessarily behind bars. The affair was an embarrassment for the higher-ups, and they didn't want to admit their terrible mistake. Instead, they tried to cast Lyon as an accomplice. Meanwhile, Davis kept his freedom, with merely a legal slap on the wrist. Perhaps because he was the son of a judge, he was only required to pay the stolen money and was removed from the Carpenter's company list. Lyons wrote a pamphlet about his ordeal, though readers may have been dissuaded from his plight by the elaborate title. Narrative of Patrick Lyon, who suffered 3 months' severe imprisonment in Philadelphia's jail on merely a vague suspicion of being concerned in a robbery of the Bank of Pennsylvania, with his remarks thereon. End quote. In 1805, after a period of hardship, his good name in mud, Lyon rallied against the prosecutors in a landmark civil case. The jury deliberated for 4 hours and returned with a whopping $12,000 verdict in favor of Lyon. The defendants appealed and were granted a new trial set to begin on March 1807. Just as the second trial was to start, an agreement was reached, awarding Lyon $9,000. Lyon became symbolic of an individual who'd beaten the system. A portrait was commissioned of him by artist John Neagle in 1826, though this had a more straightforward title than the subject's pamphlet, Pat Lyon at the Forge. It was often reproduced in media for the time. Lyon became a symbol of the ingenious craftsman. He went through persecution because he was a recent immigrant. Restored in fortune, he became affiliated with the same people who had oppressed him. In attempting to secure justice, an innocent man had been subjected to the very worst the concept had to offer. He now financially secure, though perhaps he chose to keep his funds in a vault other than those of the Bank of Philadelphia. National Period of Fitness. In 1762, Jean-Jacques Rousseau published his seminal work, Emile. Rousseau wrote, "Give his body constant exercise. Everyone who has considered the manner of life among the ancients attributes the strength of the body and mind by which they are distinguished by men of our own day to their gymnastic exercises." Rousseau was influential in developing the scheme of modern gymnastics. The body must be vigorous to obey the soul. The weaker the body, the more it commands. The stronger the body, the more it obeys. European cultures influenced fitness in the United States during the national period. Immigrants brought many aspects of their heritage to the United States, including German and Swedish gymnastics. Constant threats to independence and nationalism from foreign invasion were prevalent in Europe and not the United States. German and Swedish gymnastic programs failed to attain the same level of popularity as it did in Europe. However, early leaders in the United States were conscious of the need for exercise and fitness. Benjamin Franklin recommended regular physical activity, including running, swimming, and fundamental forms of resistance training for health purposes. President Thomas Jefferson acknowledged the necessity for fitness, although maybe to a somewhat extreme measure. Not less than 2 hours a day should be devoted to exercise, and the weather shall be little regarded. If the body is feeble, the mind will not be strong. When you think about the Founding Fathers, fitness isn't exactly the first thing that comes to mind. Granted, things were a whole lot different in the 1700s. For one, life expectancy in the middle of the century was about 35 to 40 years old. A man's shelf life could be drastically shortened by poor diet, abusive labor, and even a musket ball to the brain. Yet, despite those conditions, guys back then were in actually decent shape. One of the earliest daily newspapers, The Spectator, had one of its first references to using dumbbells to work out. However, the weight training instruments were quite a bit different than the ones you're familiar with today. It would be like a cord or a pulley and a weight that you'd pull, kind of like a lat pull down at the modern gym. Back in the 18th century, some men worked out their issues by setting duel dates. Every duel form developed a friendly sport version. Fist duels became boxing, and later MMA. Sword duels led to fencing, and pistol duels even got their own Olympic sport. This, of course, excludes the non-friendly versions, which could be deadly, serious, and final. Just ask Alexander Hamilton. In 18th century North America, somewhere around 90% of people were involved in agriculture. Near ceaseless multi-seasonal farming was completely unautomated too. Plowing, harrowing, seeding, tending to animals, haying, and harvesting were all done by hand. In a Dutch study, researchers compared the activity levels of modern office workers with those of actors mimicking the daily lives of 19th century Australian settlers. The findings: the actors' activity levels were 1.6 times higher, the equivalent of walking 3 to 8 more miles a day. It would have been similar in 1776. Technology didn't change much for the average farmer at that time. You've been listening to the RPTM podcast. If you like what you hear, please rate us on whatever platform you're listening on. Join us again next week when we talk about the seen and unseen of U.S. history. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, for more information, check out the show notes on my website. The show was produced by me. Our editor is me. Written and researched by me. Music is Down South by Bliv Beats. I'm Ryan Lancaster, and this was the RPTM podcast.